Good afternoon and welcome to Primetime at the Bethel University Library. My name is Robin Reilersdam and I serve as Provost at Bethel. Primetime celebrates learning in and beyond the classroom at Bethel. Faculty, students, and staff collaborate, and it's also supported by Friends of the Bethel Library, the Bethel Teaching and Learning Center, and other offices on campus. So welcome. Primetime archives videos of past presentations, so if you'd like to explore them, you can find them at the BU Digital Library YouTube channel or on the Spark Digital Archive. And coming up on Tuesday, November 4, student presenter Tiara Lamb will share about her study abroad experience in Peru. So today, I'm delighted to welcome you to an Edgren Scholars presentation. The Edgren Scholars program supports faculty and student research. Faculty and students collaborate on a project that must be one that has the potential to make a significant contribution to a given field, and the project must reflect meaningful collaboration between students and faculty. And it's named after our founder, John Alexis Edgren. One of the key principles that he wrote about in the 19th century was that the relation between teachers and pupil should not be that of commander and subject, but rather one of true friendship and helpfulness. And I think we'll see that this afternoon. So in this spirit, we established the Edgren Scholars Program, and today's scholars team is led by Dr. Graciela Perez, Professor of Languages and Cultures, and Associate Researcher, Junior Business and Spanish major Amelie Hansen. And they will share their project From Damnation to Digital Dissolution, Justice in the Don Juan Myth from Baroque to Cyberculture. So welcome them with me.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Perez, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Amelie Hansen, who was a student in my very first class at Bethel. From the beginning, Amelie's remarkable analytical and interpretative skills distinguish her, and it was this intellectual maturity that led me to invite her to collaborate in this research project. Amelie is a double major in business and Spanish, and this interdisciplinary background became a defining strength of our study. She brought together the interpretive depth of literary analysis and the critical reasoning and problem-solving perspectives characteristics of business studies. The synthesis reflects the kind of integrative and holistic education we try to cultivate at Bethel, one that encourages students to draw meaningful connections across disciplines in pursuit of deeper understanding. Our project, conducted under the Edgren Scholar Program, explores the enduring myth of Don Juan through a comparative and interdisciplinary lens. Although designed as a summer research opportunity, Amelie's engagement with the topic began much earlier, when she participated in our Spanish program in Segovia, Spain. Immersed in the language and the culture that gave birth to the Don Juan legend, she began reading El Burlador de Sevilla from the 17th century play by Tirso de Molina, and that introduced this iconic character. Walking the cobblestone streets of Seville, where Don Juan is said to have lived out his legendary story, offer Amelie a vivid, immersive context for her reading. Experiencing firsthand the religious, moral, and social atmosphere of early modern Spain that gave birth new life to the text and a deeper understanding of its complex moral universe. Our research asks how the motif of divine justice evolves across centuries of reinterpretations of the Don Juan myth. Specifically, we examine how each version reflects the ongoing tension between human desire and divine justice, and how characters' rejection of moral and religious values sheds light on broader philosophical and theological debates about faith, morality, and redemption. This project draws from multiple disciplines: literature, music, philosophy, psychology, sociology, biblical studies, and comparative theology. To trace how Don Juan's story has been retold from Tirso de Molina's 17th century play to Mozart and Da Ponte's 18th century opera Don Giovanni, Across time and culture, each version contributes to a continuing dialogue about the human condition, exploring the same essential tensions between freedom and responsibility, passion and faith, rebellion and repentance. At first glance, studying a centuries-old literary figure may seem distant from contemporary experience. Yet, Don Juan continues to resonate precisely because he embodies enduring human dilemmas. The conflict between moral and restraint and self-gratification, between spiritual belief and secular desire, and between human autonomy and divine authority. In an increasingly secular age, Don Juan myth invites us to reconsider the relevance of moral and spiritual frameworks in shaping human identity. Ultimately, through this comparative, multicultural, and multilingual exploration, our goal is to bridge disciplinary divides connecting literature, music, theology, and social sciences to foster a richer understanding of the intersection between faith, culture, and the human experience. And now Amelie is going to continue. Okay.
Thank you. Again, thank you so much to Dr. Perez for helping me in this research project. We have a lot to cover today, so stick with me. Again, I just want to start with some thank yous. First of all, thank you to Bethel University and all of the staff that made this possible, especially the Edgren Scholar Selection Committee and Dr. Van Aragon, the Dean of Faculty. As stated, I was one of the Edgren Scholar recipients this past summer. A little bit about the Edgren Scholar program. It's been around since 2001. It encourages students to pursue scholarship, to strengthen faculty and student partnerships through this collaborative research, and to raise the level of scholarship and discussion in the world of ideas at Bethel University. Dr. Perez was extremely helpful in this process as my professor, her first semester here at Bethel, also as a research partner and a good friend throughout the summer. I also want to thank Nicholas Jarman, who helped with the translation of this paper. So I'll touch on this more a little bit later, but we wrote this paper originally in English, and now it's being translated into Spanish. So he's been an amazing help for that. And then also just friends and family who have been nothing but supportive. Many of you who are here today, thank you, throughout this process. And then any other listeners who I haven't met yet, thank you, and I'm so excited to share with you what we've researched this summer. Again, a little bit of an intro about who I am. Receiving from Graciela, I'm a Spanish and business marketing major, and I studied abroad this past spring. That really laid the foundation for this presentation. It gave me an expanded worldview, and it gave a context. As she said, I walked the streets of Sevilla with my people that I was with for study abroad, so it was really cool to be able to see where this character of Don Juan would have lived and where the story would have taken place. I do hope to incorporate both business and Spanish wherever that leads me later on. And it really has opened so many doors for me in so many ways, not only to grow academically in this sense, but also in my faith. Regarding the presentations that we'll be giving for this Edgren Scholar, today is my first in the library. Additionally, I will be giving a presentation in Spanish to the Spanish department faculty later this semester, I believe. And then Graciela and I will travel to a professional conference in the spring where we will give our presentation once more. So just a broad range of experiences through all these presentations, which is another honor to be able to do. A couple more details about this project and the research process. So as Dr. Perez stated, I began in Segovia, Spain this past spring. I began with reading the Burlador de Sevilla book, which really laid a foundation. At that point, she had reached out to me early in the spring asking if I was interested in this program, and so we decided to apply together, but at that point we were not aware if we had gotten the scholarship or not yet. But I decided to start reading that first text, which became the first of the 4 that we selected for our project. And we weren't sure yet, but eventually by the end of our study abroad program, we were given this grant. So then starting in the beginning of the summer, we started our work. We met over Zoom and we met in person multiple times a week. We decided on our 4 texts, and then we also were able to incorporate the Bible. as I'll touch on later, but there's many religious references within the text. So that was really exciting, and we spent a lot of hours together talking through these texts and talking through the religious and academic themes and the takeaways that we had from that. And we really became co-workers, and she's been an amazing mentor to me. We were talking yesterday before the presentation, and I thought it was really profound how she said, this is how everyone begins. So that mentor-mentee relationship is really impactful to me. And she's been not only a guide in the world of academic writing and Spanish literature, but also in faith. So a little bit more about our paper. We started in the beginning of the summer with the goal of around 20 to 21 pages, and we just couldn't stop writing. So we ended with about 30, a little more than 30 pages, written in fully English this summer, although a lot of our discussions were in Spanish and all of our texts were in Spanish, so it was both multilingual in that way. And then, like I said, we're working on translating it into Spanish currently. It will soon be published. If you want to read the paper, it will be announced university-wide once the venue is chosen. And it's really an honor to be able to be a published author in college. That's really, really exciting, and I'm so grateful to the Graciela and the whole program. So now that you've been given the background on our project and a little bit of context for the presentation, I will give a brief overview of the 4 different works that we covered and the key themes that are present in each. And then I will wrap up with a summary and conclusions of what we discussed in our paper. Additionally, just a little bit more about the paper. It is a comparative study between those 4 versions. If you want a summary after this presentation is over, you have in your handout a summary of each of the stories. And then, like she stated, it spans over 400 years. So that societal change is really profound over time. It's inter and multicultural as we start in the Baroque society of Spain and we move to modern day 21st century Spain. We also touch on certain important parts during history, such as the Romantic movement in Spain and the Enlightenment movement in Italy, as we'll see through Mozart and Ponce's work. And then it's interdisciplinary, incorporating faith, culture, and human experience. And then we also have 3 of the works that are plays, and then 1 that's an opera, with Mozart and the way he uses music to relay themes and evoke this emotion. And then also, again, the ability to use the Bible as a religious reference. And I thought it was really profound how there's key themes in the text. So even if you don't come from a religious background, it's a very essential part of the text. And then before I give the summaries, I want to kind of give a brief overview of anybody who's not aware of what a Don Juan or Don Juan myth is. He is a mythical character. It's often a man until we see the most recent text. It is actually a man and a woman and how they act. But this archetype often proposes to women. He promises marriage, and then he ends up leaving them and abandoning them afterwards, and then he finds another woman to find afterwards. So it's kind of this continual pursuit. He also, back in the time when the first few texts were written, the honor system was very important. So the fathers would have the job of protecting the daughters, and so when they could not be protected, they would try to come to the rescue, and they would often be killed by the Don Juan. Often in a duel, as they did back in the day. And then a lot of the times in the end of the story, the revenge of the father who was killed, who also acts in a way as God, attempts to convert this Don Juan to Christianity to give him this opportunity of redemption. But most of the time Don Juan refuses, and it does not end well. So a lot of times this is seen through this dinner scene at the very end of the story. All right, so starting with our first text, A Burlador de Sevilla, was written around 1630, and this really laid the framework for this Don Juan myth. It was written by Tirso de Molina during a time when Spanish society was Baroque Spanish society, and it really established this archetype of a trickster who will eventually pay for his actions. So I have these timeline layouts. Some of these central themes are in the middle in the yellow, and then it's just kind of a summary very similar to what you have in your handout. So in this story, Don Juan tricks the Duchess and then escapes through the window once he's discovered by the king. He then escapes to Spain, as it began in Italy, and encounters his next victim, and then escapes shortly after. So you already see this routine of escape. And then he seduces another woman who is already engaged, And this is a case where the father steps in to encounter the Don Juan, and he is eventually killed because of this in an attempt to rescue his daughter. Next, Don Juan escapes to a village wedding where he attempts to separate the bride from the groom. And once he's successful in that, he escapes one last time. And there's this element of when the father is killed, he seeks revenge. So Don Juan reaches out to the father in this circumstance, and the father invites him to a dinner, which is kind of represents the Last Supper, so those biblical elements, and he is sentenced to hell at the end of the dinner as he refuses to repent. So we'll see this is a very common layout of the Don Juan story. So covering quickly over the next text, Don Giovanni. The previous was a play, and this one is an opera. So in this, it's important to note that this starts in the middle after the first woman has already been tricked. It premiered in 1878 by Mozart and Dupont, and has many religious elements as well, as they all do. So it starts out when he attempts to seduce Doña Ana in her home, and then he is caught by the father, who then he subsequently assassinates. He escapes to his next victim, who is also about to be married, and then he goes on the run after this. So his servant is disguised as him, and he is disguised as his servant, so he's able to escape. So there is actually a search party looking out for him, but they mistake him for his servant, so he gets away. And then we come back to this graveyard scene with the father, where the father, or the ghost of the father at this point, invites Don Juan to dinner in this display of invitation of final redemption. So this statue of the dead father, or the gravestone, gives Don Giovanni in this circumstance, which is also another name for the Don Juan, gives him one last chance to repent, but he ultimately refuses multiple times, and so he also is sentenced to hell during the sacrilegious dinner scene. So very intense. Next we have the Don Juan Tenorio. This was written in 1844 by Zoria, and this is a key turning point, as these past two have really focused on the damnation of this character and the way in which he refuses to repent. But this was written during Romantic era, and so there's a lot of emphasis on free will and choice. So in the end, I'll spoil it for you, sorry, he does repent and he is saved. So it starts out where him and his rival meet together after a year. They made a bet who could trick the most women. And so they decide to renew the bet once more. And so Don Juan tricks Don Luis's, so one of the victims, there's two, is actually Don Luis's fiance. So Don Juan captures him, so he's unable to fulfill the bet, so Don Juan will win regardless. And then the next victim is a young nun. So this is where you see those religious elements tying in again. So although there's not a direct religious message, there's definitely those themes and a strong presence of the Catholic Church. But this is where the uncharacteristic change takes place as he confesses his love for her, as we have not seen before in a genuine way. So this also ties into the reflection of society, which I'll touch on more later. Again, the father comes to the rescue but is killed in the duel, and then as Don Juan escapes, per usual, he returns then to Seville years later, where he encounters the gravestones of Doña Ana and her father, and is given salvation ultimately through Doña Ana and the way in which she made a bet with God, that they would, if he repents, that they would both be able to live in heaven together in the end. So this really just emphasizes the choice and the free will in the society of the time and how that has changed. And then our last major text is the Don Juan at Simétrico da España. And within this title even, there's more of a symmetry between the roles of men and women. So Simétrico is kind of a play on words in that way. It was written in 2008 by Jesus Campos Garcia. And again, tying into those religious elements, it starts in a garden setting where they both meet, which can be inferred to be a Garden of Eden. So it starts as Don Juan is a professor and Doña Inés is a student, so scandalous as usual. And then both Don Juan and Doña Inés use each other in multiple ways. So there's more of an equal mistreatment in comparison to the past. So this equality of the 21st century, but in a bad light. So in this act of rebellion, Doña Inés ruins the reputation of the professor Don Juan during a dinner with the faculty. And then the school director discovers this relationship and both of their livelihoods are threatened, his job as a professor and her role as a student. So they decide to take revenge. So in this case, instead of the father just acting, and instead of the Don Juan acting against the father, it's both of them acting against the school director. So you can see the way in which this father figure is also represented. Since there's such an absence of God, the father figure is seen in the school director and the presence of God in that sort of way, in that authority. And then upon Don Juan's return, after they escape after this, him and the ghost of Doña Inés mock the warnings of this deceased director. And so they essentially make a game out of final damnation. So we see in the first two stories, how they are sentenced to hell. In the third, how he's able to receive that redemption. And then finally in the 21st century, with that lack of a religious foundation, how it's just a mockery, it's a game to them. So from those main summaries, I've brought out a few key themes. So the first is the society of the time. So we'll go through each of the texts and how they represent these themes. So in the first, it's 17th century Spain with a strong Catholic influence. And it's actually, Don Juan is a believer. He believes in the presence of God in this circumstance, but he just refuses to abide by his rules. In Don Giovanni, it takes place in Italy during the Enlightenment. So there's a lot of that Enlightenment emphasis on individuality. In Don Juan Tenorio, it's Romantic era Spain. So again, that ability for free will, that emphasis on emotion. And then in the 21st century version, Don Juan Symmetrico, it's really reflected in the immorality of many of those actions that Don Juan and Doña Inés take. And then the next is the conquest. So these happen in all of the stories. Some of the main elements is that all social classes are victims. So from peasants to nobility, as Don Juan is nobility, he takes that opportunity, that position of power, to really show his disregard for social structures and disregard for any structure that society has put in place as a whole. And then disruption overall. So this story really is a myth of disruption and how Don Juan acts against all that is the norm. In the first story, he acts against the Catholic Church. He disrupts their values and their beliefs. And in Don Giovanni, he disrupts multiple relationships as he attends these weddings, as he attempts to trick different women. And then in Don Juan Tenorio, he ends up kidnapping the nun from the convent as part of this bet. So that really ties into disruption of her life and disruption of the lives of the families. And then in the most recent version, the disruption is caused by both Don Juan and Doña Inés as that equality comes into play in the 21st century, and the university faculty as they disturb that dinner. The next is the action against authority that is so central to the Don Juan myth. He has a great disregard for patriarchs, especially in the first two, in which in society the fathers were the most important figure. He dishonors the daughters through this. He assassinates the fathers, and then he mocks the gravestones or the ghosts of those fathers once they have passed away. He also mocks the church in many different ways. He refuses to acknowledge the sacred nature of the sanctuary of the church itself, and he acts contrary to ultimate authority, which is God. And then in the 21st century version, because there's such a lack of God, it's kind of represented, as I stated, through the school director. So both of the characters act against the school director and mock his authority. And then the Last Supper. So this is that final dinner scene in El Burlador de Sevilla. It results in damnation. In Don Giovanni, it results in the same. And then we see that change into Don Juan Tenorio, in which he achieves salvation. And then the Don Juan Symmetrico, in which there is mockery. And this also is a biblical element as the Last Supper before the crucifixion, before this important event. And then another key element, I don't have a slide for this, but is the justice, tying back into the title of our story. So the justice in each of these stories. In the first, God's justice serves as an alert. He serves as the ultimate power and the ultimate importance to society and to the writer and to Don Juan at the time, as he acknowledges the existence of God. In Mozart and Ponte's Don Giovanni, his justice turns more into terror of God. God is not present throughout the entire story, but instead at the end. And then as it kind of diminishes through Zoria, it is also equally important, but the character is able to achieve that salvation. So God is an important idea, but his justice is not overpowering, all-powerful. And then in the final 21st century version, there is a complete absence of justice as a result of the absence of God. So this change in the concept of justice mirrors the trajectory of human society as it begins stemming from God and religion and dissolves into individual decision of what justice is and how it can be misconstrued in order to fit one's desires. So moving on to the table of contents, I won't read through all of this, but this is the general framework for our paper. I believe it is also in your handout if you want to take a closer look at it. But Graciela and I met to kind of flesh out these ideas and develop our topics that we wanted to choose. We chose these because of the ties that they have to religion, to theology, to society, to justice and its evolution, and not only justice itself, but how it's viewed by society, how God's justice is viewed by society. It is both historical and modern, as we see how the accepted ethics change over time. And then it's also focused on human nature and how sin, morality, and mortality is viewed and changes over time. And then lastly, the digital realm, as that is relevant to us today, and the effect that that has on morals and the human character. So just reading through a couple of the titles. Our first is The Foundations of the Don Juan Myth, Origins, Motifs, and Theological Frameworks. So this is just really discussing the archetype, that first myth, and how it reflected the Catholicism of the time. The second was Romantic Redemption or Persistent Condemnation, Zoria and Mozart's Don Juan, so tying in those second and third texts, and how that relates to free will as the Romanticism of the time emphasized. The third was the digital Don Juan, Irony, Fragmentation, and Moral Ambiguity, so that idea of sin and salvation in this new online world through the most recent text. And then Comparative Reflections, tying it all together, which was Justice Transformed Across Time and Medium. So his trajectory from that damnation, as we saw in the beginning, to this dissolution at the end, where it's just mockery of God's power. And then the fate, so can justice still speak today, and how do we address this, and where's the hope for the future? So as we reach the culmination point of the presentation and Dr. Perez and I's research, I will work to efficiently synthesize the most important concepts that we discuss in our paper and how they pertain to our selected title of From Damnation to Digital Dissolution, Justice in the Don Juan Myth from Baroque to Cyberculture. Through the analysis and selection of our 4 selected works, it was made clear the way in which justice is not only central to God and the divine worlds, but to the nature of human beings as they act within the world and ultimately make decisions that affect themselves and those around them. However, the progression of the Don Juan myth from damnation to dissolution represents a devaluation over time of the concepts of sin and infraction, ultimately leading to a total dissolution of the human being. As we see the moral character of Don Juan crumble before our eyes as he pursues an immoral and self-defeating life through many of his actions, he simultaneously reflects the way in which society has begun to follow suit in many ways over time, beginning with a strictly Catholic Baroque-era Spain, as I covered on earlier, and ending with a modern 21st century and much more vulgar approach than those previously written of the Don Juan myth. As both a personally held belief and a concept made evident in the works of Tirso de Molina, Zoria, Mozart, and Campos Garcia, our authors, the biblical concepts are key in the human endeavor and experience on earth, not just for Don Juan, such as sin, redemption, and salvation. The guiding principles of the Bible are what have held a moral standard in so many areas throughout history, with exceptions of misuse, of course, but nevertheless an ethical and moral cornerstone in many societies. As the Don Juan myth progresses over the centuries, we read of an erosion of the acceptance of these Christian religious concepts, not as society turns to solely atheism, but rather to dissolution, in which there's not a belief in anything or belief in that God does not exist, but the pursuit of an individual gain and self-desire. For any living creature to truly thrive, there must be a connection between creator and creature. When this connection is broken, as we see most vividly in the most recent Don Juan version in the 21st century, the heart and spirit of man is deprived of the source of life, which is God himself. In this separation, we begin to see the impact of the digital realm as well, bringing us back to the connection with the first portion of our work title, From Damnation to Digital Dissolution. In this digital world, the use of the internet magnifies the absence of human beings, as they're obviously kept anonymous and hidden, as Don Juan was in his story, behind this wall of the internet, repealing their agency and validity as living, breathing humans, often and in many ways. In this invisibility, the 21st century Don Juan of Don Juan Symmetrico can act without the backlash that he once faced as he acted in the physical world in previous versions. As this medium of the internet, which importantly is not the cause but the medium through which he acts, allows for the moral dissolution of his character, he acts against the school director and often comments on the futile nature of religion. In comparison with the previous three texts, the beginning work of Tirso de Molina presented a cautionary tale, warning of the consequences sinners face for their immoral actions against God. The Don Juan Tenoria of Zuria demonstrated much less urgency than the previous work, as Don Juan repented in his final hour after living an entire life of sin. And the Don Giovanni of Mozart and Dupont almost eliminates the multifaceted nature of God entirely, as he's not present until the end, when he's mentioned when the time for retribution arrives. Then, in the 21st century Don Juan Symmetrico, we see a human catastrophe displayed in quite an extreme way, as in a society devoid of this vindication, justice can only signify condemnation and an absence of hope. Due to this, mortality becomes the essence of Don Juan, and he is highly aware of its contrast with the supernatural world, which is outside of time and death itself, that death that he is facing. While salvation is an invitation to that divine existence, the digital world created by humans will only bring about eventual death, as it was created by those who cannot avoid it themselves. While thriving to access a life of plenitude and desire, humans become dependent on a source of pleasure not capable of satisfying them. The damning judgment of each character through divine justice acts as both a warning and, most importantly, an open door to society through this warning. Though this dark picture is painted, let me give you hope that I'm sure you're looking for in all of this. As we view a world of dissolution and harmful anonymity, the message of a divine justice biblically rooted in, most importantly, redemption, presents the narrow way of hope which leads to true life. As we are called to be agents of God and witnesses to his kingdom, we can use many methods to rejoin the human spirits of so many with the Lord. As literature at its core is a representation of life, Dr. Perez and I have used this medium of literature to present our message of God's incomparable redemption as it contrasts with the transgressive myth of Don Juan. As the separation of life from its source creates dissolution and damnation, it is upon all of us now to write a new version of God's ever-present redemption. As it is stated in Psalm 107:9, "For he, God, satisfies the longing soul and fills the hungry soul with goodness." True satisfaction comes from this God that is both steadfastly just in Tirso's work and gracefully merciful in the work of Zuria, a multifaceted creator who knows that the contentment of one's soul does not stem from the conquest of one's desires, but through the hope that a life lived in harmony with his will can bring. Thank you. We have a little bit of time if anyone has questions. Or not. Perfect. Yes.
Last question. You talked about how the woman changed in the last story. Did the women also develop differently in the first three stories?
Yeah, not as much. It was definitely the most impactful change in the last one, as they were more equal, but it was pretty similar in the first three, in which they were, as I stated, kind of treated as a number, treated as an object. There was one fisherwoman, Tispia, who had more of a personality. A lot of the times they wouldn't even be named, as kind of the way of showing the impact of how unimportant they were to Don Juan. But yeah, overall, the first three, they were pretty similar, pretty subdued. So that's what made it so impactful, that in that last one, she was almost as equally bad or equally as defiant as Don Juan himself. Yeah, thank you.
I have a less intellectual question. What was it like reading these in Spanish and then trying to get such deep meaning out of them?
Yeah, a lot of that was helped with Dr. Perez. It was definitely tricky. If you can imagine reading like Shakespeare, but in Spanish. So it was hard to get that original translation through, but I think just a lot of rereading helped, and then a lot of discussion. So a lot of our work this summer was just spent hours of discussing the themes that we brought out, the main ideas, getting kind of that plot line. So yeah, it was really cool to be able to do it in Spanish, and I'm excited as we're working and translating it into Spanish and then eventually presenting in Spanish as well. It was really cool to be able to even learn new words and just have that multilingual experience. Yeah.
From my perspective, Amelie was very into the reading, and then he used a lot of her analytical skills in order to get depth. So I didn't work that hard. She did.
Perfect. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you if you speak Spanish, to come to the later presentation. Yeah, and then I think it'll just be announced through Bethel once our work is published. So thanks again.